General Hospital spoilers for Monday, June 30th reveal that Sidwell had long been a shadowed figure on the periphery of Port Charles, his name whispered through corridors of power and silence. A man whose intentions were cloaked in calculated charm and ruthless resolve. For months, he had watched Sonny Corinthos from a distance, not merely observing him, but studying every move. Every decision, every crack in the seemingly impenetrable armor of the town's most feared mob boss. And now, after the slow burn of strategy and surveillance, Sidwell was ready to make his move. What had started as a mere interest in Sonny's empire had festered into a toxic obsession, fueled by resentment, envy, and a deep-seated belief that Sonny was a relic of a dying era. A man whose time had come to be replaced. Sidwell didn't just want power, he wanted Sonny undone, unmade, erased from Port Charles as though he had never existed. And he would start not with a bullet, but with a series of dangerous manipulations that would isolate Sonny, expose his weaknesses, and slowly drag him into the kind of chaos he could never control. Sidwell's campaign began with subtle precision. He used proxies to infiltrate Sonny's businesses, bribes and blackmail to turn low-level associates, and carefully orchestrated leaks that reached the ears of law enforcement. At first, Sonny brushed it off. He had weathered worse storms, survived betrayals from friends and enemies alike. But Sidwell wasn't just another challenger from the underworld. He was methodical, unpredictable, and worst of all, he knew Sonny's blind spots. He knew Sonny's devotion to family. He knew Sonny's enduring loyalty to Carly, to Michael, to his children. He even knew Sonny's grudging reliance on Jason, the one man whose moral code had always anchored Sonny's darkest instincts. Sidwell's strategy was simple: dismantle Sonny's world from the inside out. Where bullets failed, psychology would succeed. The first wave of Sidwell's assault was unseen. Sonny's shipments were rerouted. Accounts were drained. Allies grew skittish. Loyalists disappeared. And then came the rumors, whispers that Sonny had lost control. That his grip on the Corinthos organization was slipping, that he was too emotional, too distracted, too compromised. All the while, Sidwell remained invisible. He didn't need to show his face. He had already planted enough seeds to make Sonny question the foundation of his world. But when Sonny's youngest daughter, Donna, was nearly hit by a car outside her school, and no one could identify the driver, something snapped in Sonny. It wasn't just business anymore. It was personal. And that was exactly what Sidwell wanted. Sonny's rage ignited a chain reaction. He called in old favors. He deployed extra protection. He grilled his associates. But the more he tried to regain control, the more chaos spread. Sidwell's fingerprints were nowhere to be found. Yet his presence was felt everywhere. And just when Sonny thought he had stabilized the situation, another blow landed. Christina received a cryptic message with a photo of herself taken from a long-lens camera, the caption reading, "You're always being watched." That night, Sonny didn't sleep. He stood at the window of his penthouse, gripping a glass of bourbon, his mind racing through every enemy he'd ever made. But no name fit the pattern like Sidwell. Because Sidwell wasn't trying to kill him, not yet. He was trying to break him. What Sidwell didn't anticipate, however, was Sonny's capacity for resilience when it came to his family. As obsessed as Sidwell had become with dismantling Sonny's empire, he underestimated the ferocity of a man who had risen from nothing to become a kingpin. And so began a dangerous chess match, where every move had the potential to unravel lives. Sonny enlisted Jason, who was already neck-deep in his own investigations into Professor Dalton's lab and the reappearance of Britt. Jason, though burdened by his past and haunted by the truths he was unearthing, stood by Sonny, ready for war. The moment Jason confirmed that Sidwell had made contact with one of Drew's former operatives, the pieces clicked into place. Sidwell wasn't just attacking Sonny. He was building something, his own network, his own empire. And Sonny was the first domino. As Sonny prepared to strike back, Sidwell shifted tactics again. He began courting the media. Anonymous tips found their way to reporters. Suddenly, stories were circulating about Sonny's past, dredging up old crimes, insinuating new ones. The people of Port Charles, already rattled by recent chaos at General Hospital, began to murmur. Even Sonny's inner circle began to splinter. Olivia questioned his judgment. Brooke Lynn hesitated to take his calls. And Michael, torn between protecting his children and staying loyal to his father, began pulling away, much to Sidwell's delight. Sidwell understood that emotional warfare could devastate more thoroughly than any shootout ever could. Yet there was one weakness in Sidwell's plan, his arrogance. He believed he was the only one playing the long game. He didn't see that Sonny had been playing it longer. Sonny reached out to those Sidwell had ignored, the silent allies, the forgotten soldiers. The ones who owed Sonny their lives and had nothing left to lose. He reactivated old connections in Eastern Europe, called in a debt from a contact in the DEA, and worked with Curtis to trace Sidwell's offshore accounts. The more Sidwell escalated, the more Sonny adapted. But the real turning point came when Dante, working off a lead from Jason, discovered a safe house in upstate New York, one that had surveillance equipment, voice changers, burner phones, and a wall covered with photos of the Corinthos family. At the center of that wall, taped over Sonny's heart, was a handwritten note, "I will take everything you love." The discovery sent chills through everyone involved. This wasn't business. This wasn't revenge. This was pure psychological warfare, an obsession so deep it defied reason. And in that moment, Sonny made a decision. He would no longer play defense. He would draw Sidwell out, expose him, and end this once and for all. But as the trap was set, Sidwell made a counter move. He leaked false information suggesting Sonny had been secretly working with the FBI. The damage was immediate. Trust shattered. Allies vanished. Even Jason began to question if there was a mole in their midst. Port Charles was on the verge of imploding. But just as Sidwell believed he had succeeded, a new force emerged, Willow. Recently separated from Drew, betrayed, and emotionally unstable, Willow had been struggling to find purpose. Sonny offered her a position within his charity organization as a way to help her rebuild. But what Sonny didn't know was that Willow, in her own quiet way, had begun putting pieces together, documents, conversations, inconsistencies in the timeline of Sidwell's moves. And what she found shocked even her. Sidwell had ties not only to Drew, but to a failed WSB operation from years ago, one that involved missing files, illegal experiments, and a cover-up so vast it implicated high-level officials. Willow brought the evidence to Jason. And in that moment, the final puzzle piece locked into place. Sidwell wasn't just trying to destroy Sonny. He was trying to rewrite history, to burn every bridge he once crossed, and to rise from the ashes as the new uncontested power in Port Charles. But Sonny was no longer alone. With Jason, Dante, and now Willow on his side, he prepared to go after Sidwell, not just to end the threat, but to expose every crime, every manipulation, every lie. As the final confrontation loomed, Port Charles held its breath. The lines were drawn. Sidwell, now aware that his enemies were closing in, launched a final desperate plan, a bombing at a charity event hosted by Sonny, with Sasha and Michael in attendance. But thanks to Willow's warning and Jason's fast action, the bomb was defused, and Sidwell's men were apprehended. Cornered, exposed, and abandoned by his last remaining allies. Sidwell was finally captured. But even in chains, he smiled. Because for him, it was never about winning, it was about proving that Sonny could bleed, that even kings could fall. And though he failed, he left a scar on the soul of Port Charles, a reminder that darkness can rise from the most unsuspecting places. For Sonny, the war was over, but the damage lingered. And as he looked out at the city he had fought to protect, he knew peace would never come easy. Not in a town where obsessions took root like weeds. Not when tomorrow could bring a new enemy with a darker obsession. Not when power always demanded a price. Willow was no longer the passive figure who once bent under the pressure of loss and betrayal. The heartbreaks, the courtroom battles. The psychological manipulation she had endured had forged in her something new, something unyielding. She was standing at a crossroads, and she knew it. For months, people around her, friends, family, even those she once trusted, had quietly whispered, nudged, even threatened her to reconsider her relationship with Drew. They claimed he was toxic, unstable, dangerous. But to Willow, the world had always tried to dictate whom she could love and trust, and she was done surrendering to the will of others. Her defiance wasn't just about Drew. It was about reclaiming autonomy in a world that had stolen it from her time and time again. The pressure had been building like steam in a sealed chamber. Carly had made her position clear, warning her that staying with Drew would only deepen the rift with Michael and the children. Nina had offered cryptic warnings laced with subtle manipulation, and even Monica, in her own composed way, had cautioned her about where Drew's mind had gone in recent months. Yet Willow stood firm, not because she was blind to Drew's darkness, but because she saw in him a reflection of her own descent and rise. The truth was, they were both broken in places the world didn't understand, and it was in that shared brokenness that Willow found clarity. But now, the consequences of her allegiance to Drew were reaching a dangerous tipping point. The whispers had become confrontations. People were pulling away. Sunny had gone quiet. Michael had hardened. And still, Willow refused to let go. What others saw as recklessness, she saw as loyalty, perhaps misguided, perhaps fatal, but undeniably her own. And that was the real shift. This wasn't the old Willow, the girl who had once begged for acceptance. This was a woman who was ready to fight tooth and nail for the life she was choosing, not the one others thought she deserved. Yet beneath her resolve lay the quiet acknowledgement of change, of a deeper, more sinister current running through her world. There were new forces at play. Subtle manipulations that went beyond the personal. Institutions were shifting. Loyalties were fraying. The same system that had once lifted her up was now bending under the weight of its own contradictions. There was a new kind of warfare in Port Charles, a war not of bullets, but of influence, leverage, and emotional sabotage. Willow could feel it pressing down on her, trying to mold her decisions. She could see the carefully placed narratives being built to isolate her, shame her, strip her of credibility. And yet, she pressed on. Because in her heart, she knew this wasn't just about Drew anymore. It was about something much bigger, who she would become in the face of pressure, loss, and control. And that's when she realized, the war wasn't just coming. It had already begun. Sasha stood in the corner of the chapel, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the baptismal cloth still damp from Daisy's christening. The ceremony was meant to be a moment of peace, a sacred promise, a fresh start for her daughter. But instead, it had unraveled into chaos, a storm of accusations, confrontations, and revelations that no one could have predicted. As the sunlight from the stained glass windows painted fractured colors across the pews, Sasha felt none of its warmth. Her heart was heavy with dread, confusion, and the aching sense that something sacred had been violated beyond repair. The baptism had begun with grace. Sasha, dressed simply and reverently, had held Daisy close to her heart, whispering silent promises into her tiny ear. Michael had stood by her side, stoic and protective, while the guests, family, friends, enemies masked as allies, watched with bated breath. But beneath the surface of the ritual, tension simmered. Willow's absence loomed large, a wound unspoken. Drew's unexpected appearance at the rear of the church sent a shiver through the room. Then, just as the priest lifted Daisy into his arms, a voice rang out, a protest, a warning, a threat veiled as truth, and everything fell apart. Someone had accused Sasha of forging Daisy's birth certificate. Another guest muttered about Michael's rushed proposal and whether it was part of a legal strategy. Britt's name was invoked like a curse. Monica's sudden intervention stopped the service entirely. And in that moment, Daisy's cry pierced through the arguments, a sound so pure and primal that it silenced even the most self-righteous. But for Sasha, it was the sound of something cracking wide open inside her. She couldn't breathe. Not because she feared the accusations, though they were cruel and cutting, but because the very meaning of the day had been stolen from her. What should have been a moment of maternal triumph had been twisted into spectacle. And as she stared at the faces around her, so many familiar, yet unfamiliar in their judgment, Sasha realized how alone she truly was. Michael was pulled into legal damage control. Tracy whispered frantically to a lawyer. Sonny had disappeared moments earlier, chasing a threat Sasha hadn't even seen coming. Only Daisy remained still in her arms, blissfully unaware that the world around her was collapsing. And in the quiet that followed the outburst, Sasha knew this wasn't over. It was only the beginning. The baptism had become a battleground, a symbolic fracture in the facade of peace the Corinthos family tried to project. Now everyone had taken sides, Drew and Willow versus Michael and Sasha. Nina hovered in the margins, weaving manipulations. Jason had his suspicions. Britt's legacy had resurfaced like a ghost. And Sasha, fragile but unbroken, stood at the center of it all, holding the child who would either unite or destroy them. She was devastated, yes, but not defeated. Sasha's pain was evolving into something sharper, more focused. The betrayal, the public humiliation, the unraveling of trust, it was all being catalogued in her heart like a ledger. And she knew she would need to be stronger than ever to protect Daisy. Because if they were willing to sabotage her daughter's baptism, what would they do next? As the chapel emptied and the silence returned, Sasha stayed behind. She lit a candle, not for herself, but for the future. Because the war over Daisy had begun, and it would be long, brutal, and deeply personal. And in that moment of flickering light, Sasha vowed that she would no longer let herself be used, broken, or erased. No matter what came next. She would fight not just for Daisy, but for the truth, the justice, and the dignity she and her daughter deserved. The story surrounding Emma and the revelation of Vaughn's manipulation had begun as an innocent connection, an emotionally resonant moment between a young woman and a seemingly kind man brought to death. By the rescue of a lost dog. It was a symbol of kindness, of shared humanity, of a moment suspended in the chaos of Port Charles. But what Emma did not yet understand at the time was that the dog was never lost, and Vaughn was never truly kind. The entire encounter had been orchestrated with cruel precision. A psychological snare designed to lure Emma into an emotional dependency she had no idea was being constructed around her like an invisible cage. What unfolded in the days and weeks that followed was not just the unraveling of trust, but the awakening of a new, darker force within Emma, one born from betrayal. From a desperate need to reclaim her identity, and from the slow realization that the only way to survive was to become as calculating as the forces manipulating her. Emma had always been seen as the bright one, the responsible daughter of legacy and discipline, the image of composure and intellect that everyone from Jason to Anna depended upon. But inside, beneath the surface of her carefully measured smiles and organized life, something had been shifting long before Vaughn entered the picture. Years of loss, uncertainty, and pressure to live up to the Scorpio Drake name had carved out hidden chambers of doubt and exhaustion that no one saw. Vaughn, whether intentionally or not, had sensed that, had targeted her with the precision of a man who knew exactly what type of void to fill, and how to make his presence feel like a solution instead of the problem it truly was. When Emma discovered the truth, that Vaughn had planted the dog, timed their meetings, and infiltrated her world through lies and false vulnerability, it shattered something sacred within her. Not just the illusion of love or friendship, but her belief that her instincts could be trusted at all. It felt like every step she had taken toward independence had only made her more vulnerable to control. Her grief turned to silence, and that silence became obsession. She combed through texts, voice messages, timelines, any clue that could help her reconstruct the truth she had missed. It wasn't enough to know Vaughn had lied. She needed to understand how deeply the manipulation went and whether others had been complicit. Was Dalton involved? Was Jocelyn? Had her mother known? These questions consumed her, and as they did, Emma began to change. Gone was the soft-spoken student chasing stability. In her place stood a woman burning with the need to make sense of the chaos she'd been dragged into. Her every movement became measured, her every word purposeful. Those closest to her noticed, but they didn't know what to do. Jason, who had returned to her life like a ghost resurrected, watched with increasing concern. He had seen this look before, in himself, in Sunny, in Britt. It was the look of someone teetering on the edge of vengeance. But Jason said nothing. Not yet. Because he understood that whatever Emma was becoming, she needed to walk through the fire herself to come out the other side. The more Emma dug, the more she realized that Vaughn's betrayal was not an isolated incident, but part of a much wider network of psychological warfare being conducted right under Port Charles's nose. Vaughn wasn't just some twisted man with a fascination for control. He had been placed there either by Dalton's lab, the WSB, or someone even higher. The dog had been genetically modified. She learned. Part of an experiment. Tagged. Watched. And Vaughn had been reporting back to someone. This wasn't about love. It was about data, control, and perhaps something darker, obedience. She remembered how Dalton had praised her intellect. How he had said she reminded him of another promising recruit. She remembered how Jocelyn had avoided her eyes the day she first brought the dog home. Emma started connecting dots that led her to a terrifying realization. She wasn't just being manipulated emotionally. She was being studied. Watched. Targeted. And now that she knew, she wasn't just going to play defense. She was going to burn their world to the ground. The transformation was no longer emotional. It was tactical. Emma began meeting with Jason in secret. She reached out to Dante with coded requests for files. She even confronted Jocelyn in a moment of icy calm, her words carefully chosen to cut beneath the surface without revealing the full extent of what she knew. Jocelyn was stunned. But she didn't deny anything. And that silence was confirmation enough. Emma was on her own now, but she was no longer afraid. If anything, she was grateful for the pain, because it had stripped away her illusions and exposed the truth. And with truth came clarity. With clarity came strategy. Her obsession turned into mission. She began documenting her findings, creating encrypted files, tracking Vaughn's known associates. She even discovered footage, surveillance of Vaughn placing a microchip inside the dog's collar. Handing off data to a man she later identified as a WSB defector. Every piece of evidence brought her closer to understanding how deeply the corruption had spread. But it also put her in danger. Because the more she knew, the more she realized they would never let her walk away with that knowledge. And yet, Emma didn't care. She welcomed the threat. Because now, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had been used, lied to, and discarded. She was fighting for Britt, for Rocco, for Jason. For every child caught in a web of experiments masquerading as science. And in doing so, she was reclaiming the agency that had been stolen from her. When she confronted Vaughn for the last time, it wasn't with tears or screams. It was with silence. With power. She stood before him in the very same park where their story had begun and placed a collar, the same one he had used to control her, at his feet. It was no longer about revenge. It was about liberation. Hers. And it was the last time she ever looked back. But the echoes of what had happened would remain. Emma had changed, and there was no going back. She would go on to expose Dalton's lab. Collaborate with Jason to dismantle the surveillance network embedded in Port Charles, and one day, testify before a Senate committee about the use of psychological manipulation in research. She would publish papers. She would write books. But most of all, she would never forget the dog in the park, or the man who taught her the cost of trusting too soon. Because in the end, the obsession hadn't broken her. It had forged her. And in that fire, Emma Scorpio Drake had become something new. Not a victim. Not a hero. But a force. And poor Charles would never see her the same way again.